I'm going to replace the wiring in my Suburban. Now I've already done this once with this blue 0 gauge wire and it's awesome. And I've also used these connectors, but recently someone called us out in the comments talking about how awful our sketchy AF terminal connectors look, even while they praised the rest of our stuff. So today I'm going to ditch these connectors and talk about why I hate them. I hate them so much. And I'm going to switch to a totally different, much more basic connector that's going to be a lot easier to install and a lot cleaner looking, hopefully. So if you're upgrading from the stock wiring in your car, this is actually known as the Big 3 upgrade. And the 3 talks about the wires that you're replacing, which are the alternator wire, the starter wire, and the main ground wire to the block. I think that could be totally wrong. People do the Big 3 upgrade, especially if they're really into performance audio systems or have a whole bunch of electronics in their car and they've upgraded to, say, a way bigger alternator. Like in the Suburban, we have a 350 amp alternator. I don't use it. There was no point to me buying that, but I have it. I'm gonna go ahead and get one of the old wires, the wire that goes from the battery to the starter out of the Suburban. We're gonna take it over to the bench and make a new one that replicates that one, but better in every way. So these connectors right here are the ones that I cannot stand. Right now, we're going to remove this from the terminal, and we're also going to remove it from our alternator, and I'm going to replace this wire and make a new one so that I can show how to make a new wire correctly. And look at that, this one just fell right out. Perfect, that's exactly what I mean by I hate this. So to get this going, we're gonna just take off the rest of the wires that we don't need now and just leave them in the car. We'll replace them later. And we're just gonna loosen that and let it sit inside the engine bay. And then we're gonna disconnect this bottom red wire, which is our electric fan. There we go. And it's important to note that this car is off completely. Our negative cable is already unplugged, so we're not going to be shorting anything. And now for the alternator, and slip this off, and then we can just lift this off because it wasn't tight in the first place, and take this to our bench. So this is the wire I had currently in there with these very fancy looking connectors that I bought on Amazon but now can't stand. The main reason why I don't like these is because, one, these hex set screws, in my opinion, aren't as nice as crimped connectors. I'm sure that you could thread lock them and then they'd stay in better, but just like you saw a second ago, they do just come out. Thread lock might fix it, but still it's just nicer to have crimped ones. My other problem with these is that the sleeve on these blue wires is very thick and it doesn't go into this connector at the same depth as the copper wire, which means that eventually over time, the sleeve comes out, but the copper stays in and you get this exposed look. And for this connector, sure, you could heat shrink it, but then you lose your ability to get to the hex connector unless you cut the heat shrink. And then we get to this one. This one has exactly the same issue where it's impossible to get the jacket completely hidden under this connector, and you definitely can't heat shrink this shape because of its ridiculous shape. And I don't know what that was that just poured out of there. Some exposed copper because you can't heat shrink this one properly. So I'm gonna ditch these connectors and stop using them completely. So we're gonna take our 0 gauge wire, something else I bought on Amazon, I'll link to this in the description, and we're gonna cut about the same size new wire so we can just make a new one and get rid of this old one completely. So you can get better cutters than this. This is a PVC cutter from Home Depot, but it does do the job and I couldn't find my regular scissors, so we're gonna go ahead and use it. And there we go, we have our new wire. Next thing we want to do is cut enough of this blue sleeve off to fit these copper connectors. So I've used these kinds of connectors in the past, but only for my much smaller wires. Mostly because I didn't actually know that they made these connectors for wires this big, but apparently they do, so we're going to go ahead and use them. I did end up getting 2 different sizes because I wasn't sure which hole size was going to fit on my connectors, but with some quick testing, it looks like this one, the 5/16 inch, is going to work for our use, so I'm going to take these ones and put them aside. And instead of using this connector here, we're going to use one of these that looks like some other car's OEM connector, but is going to work pretty well for our use case because we have studs here that we can screw these onto, and it should look a lot less gross and have a lot less opportunity for corroding like our other setup did. So now we need to cut enough of this sleeve off so that we can fit it into our copper connector. So I'm going to cut about here. I'm going to use my knife, mostly because I don't have wire strippers for wires this big, but I'm sure if you have wire strippers, they might work a little better than whatever I'm about to do. And there we go, there's my exposed copper. That should be able to slide into my 0 gauge connector. Let's make sure we try to get all of the little strands inside. Perfect. So that works. And it's okay if we have a little bit left here because we're going to use heat shrink to cover this up in a second. Now that we've verified that our wire does fit inside this connector, we could use a crimper like this one where you put this connector inside of here, like this, and then you take a hammer and you hit the top of this to crimp the connector. We are not going to do that this time though, and we're going to use a totally different strategy where we actually solder this whole connector together. So I have these 0 gauge copper connector solder pellets. So these will fit basically inside of this connector, and we're gonna heat this up with a torch until it's all nice and molten. And then we're gonna push our 0 gauge wire into this connector to make a very solid soldered connection. Oh. Okay, and as that is nice and warm, I think that's warm enough for our wire. So let's try to push it in. Oh, and there goes solder everywhere. Perfect. Okay, and we'll let this cool for a second or so, but it looks like it's already cooling pretty fast. So now that this is definitely cooled off, you can tell that we have a pretty good connection because I can pick up this vise by the wire. That's not gonna come apart like our other connectors did. So let's take it out and get it heat shrunk. So we do have a little bit that didn't make it in because I was rushing and there was a lot of stuff going on, metal and flux going everywhere. So I'm just gonna cut these off, we should be fine. That shouldn't change the gauge of this wire enough to make it matter. And there we go. Now, we're gonna take heat shrink tubing. So this heat shrink is actually marine heat shrink. Now the difference between marine heat shrink and non-marine is that it has an adhesive within the heat shrink. And in my opinion, heat shrink without the adhesive is just not even worth it because it just eventually slides off and it doesn't make anywhere near as good of a connection and a hold on your wires as the heat shrink, as the adhesive stuff does. So that's why we're using this. But because this only comes with 2, I would definitely buy a pack of this sized heat shrink on Amazon instead next time. Otherwise, it's gonna be very expensive if you buy heat shrink in this container. So now it's time to grab our heat gun and we're gonna cut this heat shrink in half. And then we're gonna take the heat shrink and slip it over our wire assembly, turn on our heat gun and shrink the heat shrink. And there we go. So now that we've shrunk the heat shrink, we do have this little gap here where the sleeve of the wire wasn't totally lining up with the copper. And I think it would look nicer if it was completely flush, but in my opinion, this still does look much, much better than this connector. Now with this clearly non-functioning battery that I had laying around, you can see that this easily slides onto here. You can tighten this thing onto the post with this nut up top, and we can also fit our new wire and connector right over this post like so. And that is a much, much better looking connector. Something to note about these connectors is that they say 1/0 gauge, which is just 0 gauge. So anytime you see a number /0 in reference to gauge size, that means the number of zeros in the gauge. So 1/0 is 0 gauge. 4/0 is 40 gauge. It's an interesting system of measurements, but that's what it is. So if you have 0 gauge wire and 1/0 gauge connectors like this, that's the same thing. And the second number on this specific connector, this 5/16, is the size of the hole. I couldn't find the post size of this connector on Amazon, but 5/16 connectors fit perfectly over the big one. And I'll use the smaller one for the other things that I have, like our electric fan and our accessory wire that runs across the middle of the engine that will also be fixed in this wiring update. So now that we've shown that this is awesome, I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing to the other end and see if I can do a little bit of a better job. And if I do, we can just hide this one behind the alternator. I bet that the other connector cannot hold a vise like this one can. In fact, all right. Oh, nope, didn't even try.
That was perfect. That was perfect.
I want to give it a little bit of a chance. Let's see. Oh, nope, yep, that. I even tightened it that time and it still didn't hold, so yes. Just in case you need to do that, that is not a good connector. So I was hoping that I would make this one a little cleaner than the other one, but I got solder all over it and I could probably clean this up, but we'll just put this one behind the alternator and leave this one in front of the battery. So I'm gonna go take this new contraption of ours and put it into the Suburban, and we'll see how it looks. So this is our connector on the battery in the car. As you can see, this looks substantially better than the old thing that we had going on. This guy right here looks sketchy and gross, definitely sketchy. We're gonna go and tighten all this up, starting from the alternator. Okay. So for this part, it looks like it's a 10 mil, so we'll go ahead and tighten this up. So this is actually kind of interesting. It's got this cut in it so that as you tighten this nut, the top wedge pulls towards the front of the car and pulls this connection tight around the connector. So we can see that is not going anywhere. And there we go, installed. And that is one of our new wires. So we're gonna go ahead and replace all the other connectors too, because they all are sketchy and these ones look so much better and are way less sketchy. Thanks to that person who pointed out that they have these copper connectors in this size and then we can solder them on, because it's just awesome. That was fun to do too, and the molten metal looked kind of sweet. But we're not gonna shoot us doing all that because that would just be a crazy waste of time. So we hope that you watch us in future videos. If you liked this video, like the video. If you want to subscribe and see more of our videos, which you definitely should because there will be more coming, then click subscribe. And we will see you in the next video of ours.